When the Democrats counsel culture, I didn't know the Democrats counsel slavery culture.
This is the worst, the worst, the dirtiest secret in African American history, is that a surprisingly high percentage of the free Negroes in the South owned slaves themselves.
Wait a minute, you mean to tell me that it was black people that owned slaves too? Well, I better get to asking some of these niggas about my reparations.
And some of them owned, we explain it away by saying, oh, but they only own their mother, or they only own, yeah, they own their mother, they own their sister, they own their wife, and they own some other workers too.
So niggas own black people. I can't call them black people because I gotta call them niggas because black people don't own slaves.
After 15 years of indentured servitude, Mr. Johnson and his wife Mary gained their freedom.
They shouldn't have never gave them niggas their freedom.
By 1651, the Johnson family owned 250 acres of land.
And that nigga only supposed to got 50 acres and a mule. Who he steal that other 150 acres from? And what kind of slaves did he have?
And had 4 white indentured servants and 1 black.
Wait a minute, you mean to tell me a nigga owned white slaves too?
A surprisingly high number owned workers who they did not liberate.
So black slave masters, I meant niggas who owned slaves, didn't want to give black people their freedom.
On March 8, 1655, a Northampton court ruled in favor of Anthony Johnson.
Wait a minute, a white Supreme Court ruled in favor of a nigga that owned slaves? I thought the white courts didn't judge a nigga's favor because the courts were supposed to be racist.
Who was accused of unlawfully keeping his black indentured servant as a slave.
Wait a minute, that is systematic racism. Saying that black man, I meant that nigga, ain't gotta free his slaves. That is racist.
The landmark decision made Johnson
the first legal slave owner in America because he was a slave owner through the courts. He wasn't the first slave owner. He was the first legal slave owner. Google it.
Throughout the South. There were enough black free Negroes who supported the Confederacy that they voluntarily formed a regiment in the state of North Carolina to fight for the Confederacy.
That's the equivalent of today a black man putting on the sheet over his head and fighting for the KKK.
And black Confederate troops are featured on the cover of Harper's Weekly in 1863.
So black people in the Confederate Army was celebrated, and black people in the Confederate Army wasn't really offended by all the monuments that was put up for the Confederacy.
Especially, not only did they remove the Confederate cenotaph, but they deemed it to be a racist object. Those ladies from the Memorial Association, they started building these cenotaphs. They knew that the Confederate Army was an integrated army, unlike the Union Army.
That's not what I was taught in my history class. I didn't know Frederick Douglass had to damn near threaten Abraham Lincoln to let black people fight in the army.
Frederick Douglass used this as an argument to make Lincoln allow black men to fight.
Even though Abraham Lincoln didn't want him to.
He helped to organize an African-American military unit, the 54th Massachusetts.
I saw that 54th Massachusetts in the movie Glory.
Douglass personally asked young men to serve in the unit. Dozens of men, including 2 of his sons.
Next! Frederick Douglass sent his sons to fight for America. So black people was willingly fighting for the country that enslaved them. That means black people was voluntarily fighting for their country because they loved it.
Abraham Lincoln here is one of the most racist presidents we've had in modern history.
Yeah, and Joe Biden is the dumbest president we had in world history. Joe Biden is more closer to Abraham Lincoln than Donald Trump is.
Because he thought that they were incompetent, not smart enough to win.
And Joe Biden don't think black people are smart enough to get an ID and vote.
And eventually, as I said, the North was losing the war. Frederick Douglass was agitating.
Now the Democrats scared they're going to lose the election, and they got Donald Trump agitated.
And this book by Casemore persuaded him to change his mind.
Let black people fight. Old good old Abraham Lincoln.
You made a reference to Abraham Lincoln. Where did that come in? I mean,
You said
where
you're
did
Abraham
that,
Lincoln.
No, where did that? No.
You dumb son of a bitch.
I said not since Abraham Lincoln has anybody done what I've done for the black community.
Including what you and the black president done when y'all was in the White House for the black community.
I'm
I
saying
didn't say I'm Abraham Lincoln. I said not since Abraham Lincoln has anybody done what I've done for the black community.
Donald Trump done more for black people than any president in history. And he wasn't forced to either.
So, again, it's not only the myth makers who created the idealized Lincoln.
It's also the myth makers that created a racist narrative about Donald Trump. The myth makers say Donald Trump was racist.
Nobody has done more for the black community than Donald Trump.
I can vouch for that because I'm black. I can vouch for that because I'm black. A white person can't tell me shit. A white person can't tell me about shit Donald Trump ain't done for me.
And if you look, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln, possible exception, but the exception of Abraham Lincoln, nobody has done what I've done.
And if you don't think that's a fact, Google it.
We have our own myth makers in the African American historical establishment.
Like the myth tellers didn't tell us the real truth behind slavery.
Trades. It has been established that the demand for slaves during the transatlantic slave trade was fueled by the availability of a supply chain which involved African rulers and tradesmen who made a fortune out of selling people.
Shit, the Biden administration is allowing people to get sold right now.
And that is that with every person coming across the border, it empowers and it enriches the drug cartels who are involved in every single person coming across the border, including these young children.
The young children that happen to come over here and get turned into pizza and hot dogs.
These young children coming across the border are victims of human trafficking. Somebody has to get to the bottom of it. That's exactly what I wanted to do.
Well, that's not what the Biden administration want to do.
Do you plan to visit the border? Not today.
or tomorrow. Let the traffickers keep on trafficking. The Biden administration say fuck them. Next!
Between 1525 and 1866, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to North America, the Caribbean and South America, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database.
So it looked like America is not the only country that owe reparations. They done lied to us.
All the Egyptians look like Michael Jordan. All our people were black gods and kings. You know, we were not complicitous in the slave trade. There wouldn't be a slave trade
if niggas didn't sell black people.
Africans sold other Africans to white people. That was the slave trade.
So we need to go to Africa and get reparations from their ass too.
That's the first thing we honestly have to admit.
That blacks sold blacks.
The reason that was so important is that almost no white men had penetrated the interior of Africa.
But a lot of white Democrats have penetrated the mind of African Americans in America, like Joe Biden.
Well, let's talk about the substance of one of the things that Vice President Biden said at the debate when asked about the legacy of slavery.
The substance was Joe Biden said some racist shit.
In a conversation about how to deal with segregation in schools back in 1975, you told a reporter, "I don't feel responsible for the sins of my father and grandfather. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation, and I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago."
That is something a white liberal racist would say.
You said that some 40 years ago. But as you stand here tonight, what responsibility do you think that Americans need to take to repair the legacy of slavery in our country?
Yeah, Joe Biden, how do you deal with slavery in your racist past?
we bring social workers into homes of parents to help them deal with how to raise their children.
So you deal with your racist past by teaching black people how to deal with their kids. Ain't that a bitch? That is some racist shit right there.
He seemed to suggest using a record player at home for minority families to teach them how to be better parents could be part of the equation.
Joe Biden shouldn't talk about nobody parenting equation. His son married his other son's wife. Because Joe Biden equation of black people is they too dumb to raise their own kids. What kind of fucking parenting is Joe Biden doing?
It's not that they don't want to help. They don't know quite what to do play the radio, make sure the television, make sure you have the record player on at night, the phone, make sure the kids hear words.
Because according to Joe Biden, black mothers don't talk to their kids. Google it. Joe Biden say black kids is 300 words dumber than white kids at the age of 3. Google it. Joe Biden said it.
A lot of people, a lot of progressives, a lot of prominent African-American commentators talking about the substance of that answer and being horrified, if not as well as offended. What was your response to it?
His response to it, why in the hell is he going to respond to it? Last time I checked, Pete Buttigieg is gay, not black. Why don't you ask somebody who's black? Maybe they will give you a better answer on how they offended.
Revenue. In West Africa, the slave traders were known as cabochiers and they lived on the coast. They were usually appointed by the African rulers to deal directly with the European slave merchants.
So they wasn't house nigga, they was beach niggas.
It was black kingdoms like Queen Njinga's kingdom in Angola. What's now Angola? Ghana. Dahomey. They grew rich from the slave trade.
Because back then, selling slaves was better than selling crack.
Only about 10.7 million survived the dreadful journey under bondage in slave ships. The slave trade contributed to the expansion of the most powerful West African kingdoms such as Mali and Ghana, as the business became one of the main sources of foreign exchange for many years.
Slaves in Africa was big business. Africans were shipping slaves to America like China is shipping iPhones and Jordans.
Britain banned the slave trade in 1807 and the United States later abolished it in 1865.
Slavery ended in America, but not really.
Selling other Africans, they would go and wage wars just to sell other black people to white people.
And nowadays, niggas just sell you out to white people, like Joe Biden.
That there can be no realization of the American dream without grappling with the original sin of slavery.
That you said your father and your grandfather was involved in, and you ain't got shit to do with. Joe Biden, you ought to tell some niggas, if you gotta apologize for the sins of your forefathers, they should have to apologize for the sin of theirs.
1. William Onsa Seseraku, 1736 to 1770. He was a prominent 18th century Ghanaian, best known for his wrongful enslavement in the West Indies and diplomatic mission to England.
Wait a minute, and not because of his hairstyle? That nigga wig looked better than Maxine Waters. Next!
This is something we've been so ashamed about, we pretend that it's not true. It is the nasty, dirty secret of African American history.
That black people, I meant niggas, enslaved they people to white people.
2. Ifunroy Tinubu, 1810 to 1887. She was a politically significant figure in Nigerian history because of her role as a powerful female aristocrat and slave trader in pre-colonial and colonial Nigeria.
So she didn't get her political position by sucking her way up to the top, unlike somebody else we know.
We are just as corrupt and despicable as any other people.
Not according to Joe Biden.
The domestic terrorism of white supremacy has been the antagonist of our highest ideals from before the founding of this country.
Joe Biden say white supremacy is a reason for slavery.
3. Francisco Felix de Souza, 1754 to 1849.
That nigga look like the nigga off the Pirate of the Caribbean.
Palm oil, gold and slaves. The Afro-Brazilian migrated from Brazil to what is now the African Republic of Benin. He has been called the greatest slave trader
of all times. That nigga is the Muhammad Ali of slavery.
And if we have the right to oppress, we will oppress just like the white man oppressed us.
Probably worse. Look how bad we oppress ourselves. Imagine if we had white slaves, we probably would oppress the shit out of them.
And as we all now realize, this violence does not live in the past.
It lives in the Democratic Party.
The middle-aged white guy who from the outside may seem like he's got advantages, but has seen his world upended by economic and cultural and technological change.
Why? Because white people are no longer able to possess slaves?
For white Americans, it means acknowledging that the effects of slavery and Jim Crow didn't suddenly vanish in the 60s.
But somehow the Democrats done said it done reappeared in the 2000s.
Minority groups voice discontent. They're not just engaging in reverse racism or practicing political correctness. When they wage peaceful protests, they're not demanding special treatment. but the equal treatment that our founders promised.
And what did your founders promise black people, Barack Obama?
You know, I find myself once again in the same position as President Obama.
And what is that? Y'all both full of shit?
We both oppose reparations, and we both are the descendants of slaveholders.
Barack Obama, is that true?
I've been consistent in saying that this is a legacy of a troubled racial past.
So your family owned slaves, and you on here talking about slavery.
That's not an excuse for black folks. And I think the overwhelming majority of black people understand it's not an excuse.
Shouldn't this be some type of conflict of interest? Barack Obama talking about slavery?
And what's true for all Americans is we should be willing to provide people a hand up, not a handout.
What is the fucking difference? Next!
Doña Ana Joaquina dos Santos y Silva was a very renowned personality in 19th century Luanda.
Like Camilla Harris is one now.
She was an Angolan elite of African and Portuguese descent. She became rich from selling slaves in her region to slavers who wanted black people to ship to the Americas.
Well, Camilla Harris is an Asian Jamaican that got rich from giving head and send a lot of black men to jail.
And the false passport is, I'm the first African-American woman. Now, this is actually problematic on two fronts. First of all, African-American in the American context refers to connected to the legacy of slavery. That's what it means.
And not connected to the legacy of Asian and Jamaican slave owners.
Kamala Harris isn't. In that sense, she's like Obama. Obama's father was a Kenyan, so he was half Kenyan and half white.
And half gay.
Kamala Harris is half Jamaican and half Asian Indian.
And full whore.
So the African-American claim is dubious on its face.
And a lie out of its ass.
The morality tale, the whole notion of first black woman on the ticket, is based upon the idea that, hey, here is a descendant of slaves, somebody from the lowest of the low, if you will, on the social strata.
And this bitch been living off the fat of the land.
Who is now moving into a position where she could be inches from the White House. But of course, the truth in this case is the exact opposite. It's not here is a descendant of slaves. It's more accurate to say here is a descendant of the largest slave owner in Jamaica.
Who don't have a lick of black in her.
Who is inches away from the Oval Office. And that doesn't quite have the same poignant ring, does it?
Hell no, we shouldn't have two descendants of slave masters in the White House.
That is human nature. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is.
And it's not because of MAGA doing, it's because of these fucking liberals doing. They don't know they got two slave master descendants in the White House. You motherfuckers put them in.
6. Rabi Az-Zubair, 1842 to 1900. He was a Sudanese warlord and slave trader who established a powerful empire east of Lake Chad.
And let's just say that head is not just a souvenir. Some black people treated black people worse than white people back in the days.
In today's Chad, he worked as the right-hand man of the Sudanese slaveholder Sabir Rama. He conquered empires and was killed by the French after he slaughtered their emissaries.
What part of the slave geographic he was from? Chicago?
And the only way to overcome that is to be honest about it.
That is hard for the Democrats.
We are not going to heal.
We're going to keep thinking slavery is holding black people back. Next!
Named Muhammad bin Khalfan bin Khamis al-Barwani, Rumaliza was a Swahili slave and ivory trader in East Africa in the last part of the 19th century.
And he was a Jeffrey Dahmer of slavery.
Stories associated Rumaliza and his parties with the kidnapping of women, cutting off men's genitals, to be captured and sold as eunuch slaves, cutting off legs, arms and hands, piercing of noses and ears, burning villages and killings.
Mixed in with a little bit of Adolf Hitler.
Is to be honest about it, admit the truth.
And admit that it wasn't just American white people that owned slaves, the world owned slaves.
A visit to mark 400 years since the start of the transatlantic slave trade. Ghana's parliament welcomed the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives to West Africa, from where millions of Africans were sold into a life of slavery in the Americas.
By that bitch ancestors.
Nancy Pelosi described it as a grave evil which modern-day United States is reckoning with.
By saying it's Donald Trump's fault that slavery happened.
In Jamestown, Virginia, they will be having the observance of the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved person to set foot in America from Africa.
We want to thank you for building our nation.
Al-Zubair Rama Mansour. He was a slave trader in the late 19th century and later became a Sudanese governor. He was at odds with the British Governor-General Charles Gordon and was referred to as the richest and worst.
That nigga kids should be paying reparations. They still alive, but instead of doing that, we
all try to do better.
So we can forget our worse.
8. King Gezo. He was king of Dahomey.
Wait a minute, the homies, was they Crips? Because they could be in my grandmother's bloodline, or as my grandmother said, her Crip line.
King Gezo, like his predecessors, was feared for his military power and his numerous slave raids.
Well, my grandmother is feared for her left hook and her drive-bys.
He had an army of several thousand female warriors, the famous Amazons.
And she had an army of gang members from the famous Hoover Crips. It's a difference between what Joe Biden think about slavery and what Donald Trump think about slavery.
You know, Chinese leaders, if you know anything about Chinese history, it has always been the time when China has been victimized by the outer world is when they haven't been unified at home.
Joe Biden don't give a damn about human rights, but Donald Trump do, and that includes Chinese slaves.
US President Donald Trump has signed a bill condemning China for its human rights abuses against its Uyghur Muslim population.
Joe Biden say stop hating on the Chinese.
So the central, vastly overstated, the central principle of Xi Jinping is that there must be a united, tightly controlled China.
So that means we must enslave every motherfucker that come to China that ain't Chinese, and that's a Uyghur.
And he uses his rationale for the things he does based on that.
So DJ Ping rationale is enslave every motherfucker that don't belong to China.
Very serious and tragic set of actions that are taking place there in the western part of China. We've been talking and working on this for an awfully long time in the Trump administration.
And Julius Seawright has been donating to my channel for an awfully long time. Next!
I point out to him, no American president can be sustained as a president if he doesn't reflect the values of the United States.
And that's why your ass ain't gonna be president for long, because you don't respect our values as a country.
And so the idea I'm not going to speak out against what he's doing in Hong Kong.
Let you know that I don't give a damn about slavery.
We have sanctioned officials. We have told businesses they couldn't bring products out of this region. We've told businesses to be very careful that they could be too close to what's taking place there, right?
Joe Biden say wrong. Joe Biden say leave Yao Ming alone.
What he's doing with the Uyghurs in western mountains of China and Taiwan, trying to end the one China policy by making it forceful.
They should be able to force people to do whatever they want.
This is forced labor. This is forced sterilizations, forced abortions. John, the kind of things that we haven't seen in an awfully long time in this world.
Since Hitler, because Bruce Lee and Hitler is like the same person.
I said, and by the way, he said he gets it.
And you do too, Joe.
We now have conducted an exhaustive review of the facts and made the determination that, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party has committed these crimes against humanity, is continuing to try and deny these people, not just the Uyghur Muslims, but other faiths as well.
Joe Biden say that is a God-given right.
Culturally, there are different norms at each country, and their leaders are expected to follow.
So if a country culture is to have slaves, that's what the president got to do.
The simple capacity to continue to exist and to create an ethnic set of activities that we haven't seen in an awfully long time. I've referred to this over time as the stain of the century.
And Joe Biden sees slavery as some shit he don't want to take no responsibility for.
It is truly that. And today's actions is simply a continuation of the work this administration has done to try and convince the Chinese Communist Party to cease this terrible, terrible set of human rights violations that have been taking place.
And that Joe Biden is allowing to happen. And try to convince Joe Biden to give up his ties to the KKK.
And one of the reasons why it was founded was because of guys like me are Catholic.
Because Joe Biden is a proud card-carrying member. Back of a little white girl's hair.